Hello everyone, this is Max Deryagin and with me my two guests Daniel Landes and Miroslav Pošta, who will try to help me shed light on the use of machine translation in the field of AVT, audiovisual translation. So first let me introduce them. I actually have prepared a little bit of text here and I will now read it. Daniel Landes is one of AVT's leading experts on machine translation. He has a BA in Linguistics and Scandinavian Studies and specializes in video game localization. Throughout his career, he has collaborated on multiple AAA titles, and from 2015 to 2018, he was at the helm of the localization efforts of a video game project as German translator and editor. Daniel has a special interest in the sustainability of the localization industry. My second guest, Miroslav Pošta, is also part of AVT's Machine Translation Working Group. He has a master's degree in Translation Studies and Economics and is a Czech translator, subtitler, and QCR. Miroslav is the author of the first two Czech language books on subtitling and another book on language technologies for translators. He has taught audiovisual translation at Charles University and the University of Ostrava and given lectures elsewhere in Czechia and Slovakia. At the Czech Union of Interpreters and Translators, he is responsible for AVT issues. So, to begin, could you guys please give our viewers a very brief overview of the machine translation technology in our field? Daniel, let's start with you.
Yes, Max, thank you. So to start us off, I want to give us a short introduction in the different types of machine translation that are out there right now. And I want to start with rule-based machine translation, where you basically teach the artificial intelligence a set of grammar rules. This approach is not that widely used anymore because it's quite limited and not very flexible. So if grammar changes, for example, you have to go back and teach the artificial intelligence the changes, of course. What is being used more widely these days is statistical machine translation. And in this model, basically the artificial intelligence looks at a lot of bilingual documents and finds out about the relationship between word pairs. So based on the probability of the sequence of words in a given context, the machine is going to predict a translation or a phrase in a sentence and how it's going to be translated. And all the rage right now is the neural machine translation, which is basically the next step in statistical machine translation, where you combine the statistical approach with deep learning and neural networks. However, this new miracle technology is a bit of a black box. And a black box in this context means that you have the input and the output, but you don't really know what's going on in between. So even the people who came up with this technology are unsure how the machine reaches the translation specifically. So it's kind of unpredictable, so to speak. Now, we need to know that machine translation engines need to be trained, and they are being trained by using already existing human translations. And in the traditional TEP, translation, editing, and proofreading workflow, machine translation obviously takes over the translation part, and then the human is going to take over the role of the post-editor. And that's how we come to the name that's being used and thrown around a lot these days, MTPE, for machine translation post-editing. Now, another thing that I would like to touch upon in this context is computer-assisted translation, or CAT tools. They differ from machine translation. The big names in this industry are MemoQ and Trados by SDL. And here we are talking about a special software, a translation environment, where, as you can see here on the screenshot, you have two columns. On the left side is the source text. On the right side is the translation. You have a preview pane down here below where you can see the formatting of the original document that you imported in the software. And the specialty of these computer-assisted translation softwares is that they work with integrated so-called translation memories, where all the translations made in a given project are stored and saved and can be leveraged again later, as well as glossaries or term bases that can help you out with terminology. So this can save time or can help you out, because here to the right you can see the results pane where based on the match rate of any given segment, the computer is proposing or suggesting you already translated sentences that you can use. So for example, if you translated before the sentence, I would like to buy a house, and now you're translating the sentence, I would like to buy a dog, the match rate of the segment is going to be pretty high. So you can use the previous translation and just swap out the words house and dog. In addition, if in your glossary or in your term base you have entered the translations for house and dog, the software can even suggest this change yourself, or you just can conduct it with a simple click on the term. Yeah, so I think those are the most relevant technological features for our discussion today. And giving back to you, Max.
All right. Well, okay, I see. But is there any difference between using these different kinds of machine translation for AVT and for other translation fields? Or is it all the same? Miroslav, what do you think?
Well, yes, Max. Actually, I have hands-on experience with different machine translation engines and in different domains of translation. On the one hand, it's been legal translation, namely I've worked with machine translation engines for EU legislation. And then I've seen machine translation output for subtitles for film, series, and also documentaries. I've also experimented with machine translation when translating a play. So I've been able to see the difference between these different domains in the output, and the difference between statistical and neural machine translation. Now, for legal translation, in my experience, it clearly helps. Although, of course, there's still a number of pitfalls, which we'll certainly discuss later. And even in a legal translation, machine translation engines cannot replace the human translator. You have to be very accurate in the citations and so on and so forth. But anyway, the language in legal translation or in technical translation is very repetitive. You have to use a lot of set phrases that have to be translated in a specific way. So the machine translation engines can be of help. Also, there's very little idiomaticity. Meanings are expressed very explicitly and clearly. On the contrary, in subtitling or in audiovisual translation in general, machine translation is not by far as helpful in my experience. It's especially because the language isn't as repetitive as in legal translation, for example. It calls for very creative solutions, and there are also what I would call more layers of context. There's the image, the action, the sound. We all know that irony, for example, in the tone of the speaker can change the meaning completely. Word stress is another thing that can completely change the meaning of the whole sentence, and it has to be many times it has to be translated in very different ways depending on the word stress in the sentence. There are gestures and body language which also modify or add to the meaning. So very often in audiovisual translation, the same simple sentence can have very different meanings depending on the situation, including simple things such as hey or come on. So the human translator has to supply a lot of relevant information. Let me give you an example. Let's take the sentence, did you go to the center yesterday, meaning going to the city center. When I work into Czech, I have to ask several questions. I have to ask who is being spoken to. In other words, I have to see who the person speaking is looking at. Is it one person or several people? Is it a man or a woman? What's the relationship between the speaker and the other person? In other words, what's the level? What should be the level of politeness? And in some languages, we also have to ask: did the person walk to the center, or did he or she use a vehicle? Also, the stress in the sentence plays a role. Now, I've written down all the different possibilities when working from English into Czech, when translating this sentence, and I've come up with 12 different possibilities, and I only took into account the masculine and feminine. I didn't take into account the neuter. So I have to make a decision on all these questions, while the machine translation, when it has the task of translating this same sentence, only uses whatever seems to be most statistically relevant. It will not be able to ask these questions. So if you look at the screenshot at the slide that I've prepared, first you can see that there are those 12 possibilities. And then in the next one, I've shown outputs from two major machine translation engines. One of them is Google Translate. Of course, it only could choose one of them. It shows the one where the person is going on foot. It's several people, it's men, and it's both formal and informal. E-translation, the EU translation machine translation engine, on the other hand, chose a different approach. It translated the sentence as byl jsi včera v centru, which means were you in the center yesterday? It completely dropped the verb to go and changed it to be. So you can see that machine translation engines cannot ask the same questions that we do. Now, when I used machine translation for the play, it was a kind of experiment, and I have to say that machine translation as such was not helpful at all, but the CAT tool, which I used for that, was pretty useful, and one particular feature, the auto suggest or the autocomplete functionality, was very helpful as well.
And of course, in audiovisual translation, there are additional constraints on our choices, right?
Oh yes, exactly. That's thank you for reminding me. Yes, there are a lot of additional constraints, especially we have to respect the maximum reading speed. In other words, the subtitles cannot be too fast, because if they are too fast, if there are too many characters per second, the viewers wouldn't be able to read the subtitles or enjoy the film. So we have to respect a kind of speed limit. Also, we have to respect shot or scene changes, the maximum number of characters per line or per subtitle, and therefore the wording has to be condensed. We have to use very creative tricks to communicate all the information with as few characters as possible, and sometimes the least relevant information has to be dropped altogether, but it has to be a well-informed decision, and I don't think that a machine can decide what information is the least relevant. In dubbing, on the other hand, or in addition, the text has to be lip-synced, And in a voiceover, the script has to be easy to pronounce as well. So in all types of audio-visual translation, the lines have to sound natural. So in my opinion, the result is that machine translation is much less useful for audio-visual translators, well, or at least for films and series, because we should mention that audio-visual translation also includes other types of content, such as lectures, training videos, and so on and so forth. So if we go back to post-editing machine translation, my experience is that to work with machine translated output in audiovisual translation is much more laborious and time consuming, because very often you have to improve the word choices, the word endings have to be modified. You have to change the word order. Very often literal equivalents have to be replaced by or with more natural and idiomatic language. So very often it's better to delete the machine translation, the machine translated suggestion, and do it simply the old way. Also, subtitling software usually doesn't offer those helpful cat tool features that we've mentioned, which are so common in other fields of translation. And these are features such as autocomplete or concordancing. And finally, let me also share with you my experience as a reviser, or as a QCer, as it's called these days. My experience is that some subtitlers rely on machine translation simply too much. They keep literal equivalents offered by the machine translation engine that they would probably never use without machine translation. I've seen very good translators submitting very poor work when they started using machine translation. And it's, in my opinion, it's unfair to the QCer, because then he or she has to do the rewriting, although it should really be the job of the translator. And after all, the QCer is not paid for this kind of creative work for totally rewriting the machine translated output.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've also done QC of these post-edited subtitles and noticed things quite similar to what you've just said. But regardless, even though MT is less useful in our field, in our profession, I imagine it still offers at least some advantages, doesn't it? Daniel, what's your take?
Yeah, of course, there are some advantages that you can get out of machine translation. For example, if you're stuck on a particular sentence, phrase, or expression, you can always use the machine translation as inspiration that you can polish or you can work off of. I've done that a couple of times in the past, and it saves you time to get over this initial bump. Then, of course, machine translation is very good at reproducing already existing translations. So if you're working on cooking recipes or instruction manuals, where you want to have as little variety as possible and where coherence is key, machine translation is really good for that. And machine translation also works well in cases where the quality needs to be only good enough. I'm thinking here, for example, about customer support, where you have two people that don't speak a common language and need to help each other out, or one person has a problem and the other person needs to help you out and needs to get a point across without it being super polished. So I think that would be a scenario where machine translation is quite feasible.
Yeah, I totally agree. If I can interrupt here, Daniel, you mentioned good enough quality, and I think that's very important here, because I don't think that good enough quality is the way to go in audiovisual translation, because you see, if the filmmakers, the film crew have invested a lot of talent, time and money to make the perfect film or series, then why should their effort be undermined in the home stretch by poor subtitles or dubbing, only because of machine translation?
Yeah, and also I think more often than not, filmmakers are not made aware of the fact that their stuff is machine translated. I think if they were, they wouldn't be happy about that for sure. I mean, imagine like Quentin Tarantino told that his last and 10th film is going to be machine translated. He probably would be furious, and so would be other content creators if only they were told. But I think they aren't, and this lack of transparency is quite an issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, to add another potential advantage to keep it a little bit positive, machine translation can save you some typing, not much typing, but some typing in some cases where there's something repetitive, because there are some repetitive sentences or expressions such as nice to meet you, congratulations, or way to go. Although, of course, they can also be translated in different ways in different situations, sometimes in some languages. But actually, as translators, we don't think about these sentences very much. We almost use our autopilot to translate these set phrases, and also most of us translators are pretty fast typers. Many of us can touch type, so machine translation is not so much help here either. And finally, the last advantage I can think of is that it can give you a good laugh. You can share those outputs, the funny outputs with your friends and colleagues. But anyway, that's all the advantages I can think of. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I think the last one is a good point. I've seen many shared machine translation in a work chat, and we've gotten quite a good laugh out of those. Yeah, moving on to disadvantages. So what we've already come across before as well is the context that the machine can understand only in a very limited fashion. So Lucia Spezia from the University of Sheffield, for example, said in a talk from the Goethe Institute in London that machine translation, even in the near future, will only be able to understand maximal a couple of pages in a book, but it will never be able to understand an entire book due to the underlying technical framework. And this is not going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, actually, in my experience, MT engines, when it comes to AVT, don't really understand what's going on in the film or episode of a series. So they can often give you a suggestion that works linguistically, but doesn't make logical sense in the context of the plot or scene or maybe action on screen, stuff like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And they're also prone to randomly omitting words when they translate, and they struggle with proper names. And I think, Mirek, you had a pretty good example on that.
Oh yeah. For example, I've seen the name of the company Apple computer translated into Czech literally as jablečný počítač, or which sounds like a computer made of apples. So it's quite common that the machine translation engine translates things that should not be translated. And with neural machine translation, you can see what you did not see previously with statistical machine translation, and it is that the engine invents neologisms. I can give you an example. For example, the name of the composer and violinist Paganini has been translated, or can be translated by a neural machine translation engine into Czech as Pohanini. Simply, it takes a part of the word pagan, translates it literally from English into Czech, and adds the rest of the word from the original. So I've seen Paganini becoming Pohanini in Czech. And also it can randomly omit and add words, which is very tricky because you have to be very careful. It's like revising a very poor translators, human translators output. And there's another problem when machine translation engines are used to translate between two languages through a third language, especially or mostly it's English. So I've seen, for example, the Czech word cizinec, which means foreigner, translated into Russian as, and now, sorry, Max, for my pronunciation, as innoplanetyanin, which means extraterrestrial. So it's clear it went through English, through the English word alien, and the foreigner became an extraterrestrial. So it can be very tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for those really good examples. Another thing is that we've learned before that machine translation is very good at reproducing translations that have been done before. As a consequence, machine translation really struggles when it has to come up with new solutions and being creative. So, for example, if you have to write dialogue where you can't translate literally but have to transcreate, humans will always produce a more natural sounding output than a machine. The next thing that I would like to mention is the quality that can be quite inconsistent. The quality of the output from the machine depends on a lot of different factors. So, for example, we have the curation and the quality of the corpora. And here I would just like to mention the difference between DeepL and Google Translate, where DeepL is taking a more fine-tuned approach and is taking better care of the corpora they use as backend, whereas Google Translate goes into the mass and has a lot of text to work with, but it's not as fine-tuned. Then, as Mirek mentioned before, we have the problem of English as a pivot language, so the quality between language pairs can also vary greatly, depending on if you have bilingual corpora available for the specific language pair. Then we have the type of text. Do you translate a creative text or instructive text? The machine is going to be able to do the latter, and it's going to struggle with the first one. And the style of the source text is also going to be influential, because if you have long, winded sentences versus short and concise writing, the machine is going to have an easier time translate the short sentence, obviously. It also depends on if the source text was written with machine translation in mind. So if the human who wrote the original text already took into consideration that they should make their sentence structure as easy as possible, use no colloquialism and such things. And then the last factor in the quality department is the preparation of the source text. Has it been properly segmented? Has it been made so that the machine can easily grasp and understand the units of meaning? The next thing that we've already briefly touched upon earlier is the training aspects. So you have to understand that there's no machine translation engine that's good for everything just out of the gate. You have to train your engines for the specific field that you want to use them in. So there's always an upfront investment required for each new project that you're going to tackle. And one thing that is most important for us translators is the so-called translator's bias. So what do we mean by that? This means that a translator is already influenced when they see the output from the machine translation, and will lose a portion of their own creative voice when they simply post-edit a machine translation. Dorothy Kenny and Marion Winters from Dublin City University have done an experiment on this, and they found out that the creative voice of a translator will be diminished by around 33%. In the same vein, we have the problem that the homogeneity of machine translation engines that use so-called feedback loops, where the output gets corrected and then fed back into the machine translation, can eventually lead to reduced richness and diversity of language, because basically it's going to be all the same.
Yeah, this potential erosion of language is certainly a danger in the long term. It's one possible consequence of using MT in our profession. Can you think of any other such consequences? Daniel?
Yeah, most definitely. There are a couple of them. I'm going to divide them into 3 categories, actually, and I want to start with the economic aspect. So as I think all of us are aware of, is that the current situation of translators is already pretty precarious, since our rates have stagnated in the past 20 years, and there hasn't been adjustment for inflation, for example. Now that the discourse around MTPE suggests that the machine is doing the actual work and the heavy lifting, we are afraid that rates are going to be reduced even further, because obviously we don't do as much work anymore. However, Felix do Carmo from the University of Surrey argues that the opposite is the case. He says that you actually need highly skilled and trained linguists for post-editing a machine translation, and if the pay is not adequate, the industry will definitely suffer from brain drain.
Yeah, I actually think that it already is happening, and it actually has been happening for quite a while. People just are leaving our profession because of, as you've said, the stagnated rates, and then deteriorating working conditions. And as I've seen a lot of this firsthand as secretary of the British Subtitlers Association, that people have told me that they have to work full time, and even then they don't make the minimum monthly salary in their country, so they cannot sustain their livelihood or that of their family. And they say that apparently AVT is at least one of the least well-paid types of translation. So what they do is either they change the type of translation they provide, or they change professions altogether. They can become a teacher, or they can go in-house rather than be a freelancer, or something like that. And I think in that respect, MT poses a problem, because many people have told me that they don't see themselves becoming post-editors. That's not what they signed up for. That's not what they want to do. They do not want to be fixing what a machine wrote. They want to be translating themselves. They want to be creative. They want to be authors. And that's where they find joy, not in post-editing. So yeah, this is also an issue, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. And thank you for those first-hand experiences, which totally match everything that I've heard or lived through in the industry so far. But back to consequences. Since the quality of the MT output varies so much, translators technically would have to charge by the hour, because they don't know how much time they're going to need to fix the machine translation output. However, for the big players, the companies in this industry, this is not very attractive, because it's easier to budget with fixed units like words or minutes. Then if we look at quality, the instructions that go around these days are leave as much of the machine translation output as possible. And this leads to 2 problems. In the long run, quality will suffer because we are adapting to the machine instead of the machine to us. And also, as a translator, you spend a lot of time deciding whether you should change something or whether it's an acceptable translation. Over time, we also see the danger that post editors could become blind to machine language, and again, the overall quality will suffer. And another thing that we've already briefly touched on earlier is that neural machine translation can be quite unpredictable. So even if the output can sound quite natural and fluent, mistranslations are very difficult to spot, and you need to be working highly focused 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads us directly into the scalability argument. Let's face it, humans are always going to be the bottleneck, since they have to be so highly focused and working all the time when they post-edit machine translation. So there's a limit to how much you can scale. And since this work is going to be less paid, but more intensive in terms of concentration work, burnout is a very possible danger that can occur here. Again, here machine translation can affect the way we translate as humans in the long run, because we're going to adapt to the machine instead of the other way around. And if the job is, like you said before, Max, is not attractive anymore, even if the people who are post-edit are a bit more efficient, potentially, if people are leaving the industry, you won't have enough people to work with. So your scalability is also going down the drain. And another argument that Mirek mentioned earlier as well is that the time that you save during the translation step is eventually going to come back to you during the quality control. So you haven't really saved time, you've just shifted the time necessary into the lower paying step of the workflow, which also cannot be the right way to go.
And there is also, I think, this other consequence that's related to the translator's status changing from author to post-editor. And it's quite important because in many European countries, translators are considered authors. So their translations are their intellectual properties. And then companies can ask them for permission to use those intellectual properties and pay them royalties. This is called economic rights. There are also moral rights, among which is the right to be credited. But these royalties for many people in Europe is a huge part of their income, in some cases up to 50%. And if the policymakers don't do it right, and this status changes to post-editor, and they lose their author's rights, they lose all that money. Imagine losing half of your income over such a technicality. I mean, you won't be able to support yourself or your family anymore. So that's also one problematic consequence, I think. Yeah, and it seems to me that the disadvantages far outweigh the advantages here. So does this mean that we should just be completely against MT in AVT, or is there a way to maybe fix this imbalance and make MT beneficial and sustainable to all? Or maybe are there any alternatives to it? Mirek?
Yes, Max, definitely. I think there are lots of other alternatives or options and tools and ways how to help translators and subtitlers. Let me cover the technical aspects. We've seen that the value added by machine translation is quite questionable in audiovisual translation. And I feel that developers, in spite of that, don't pay enough attention to other technologies and practices that might be much more beneficial and less costly. We've already mentioned CAT features that are very common in other types of translation, but very rarely implemented in subtitling software, especially concordancing, which is searching translation memories. And it is something that could really help much more than one machine translated sentence when you have access to lots of examples of the same sentence or same expression being translated into the other language. Concordancing can also be of great help when it comes to consistency. For example, when several people are working on the same program, on the same series, for example. We've also mentioned term base or glossary lookup, which can be quite helpful, although not so much in audiovisual translation, but it can be helpful for documentaries, for example. And then there's my favorite feature, which is autocomplete. You've seen a screenshot of a cat tool. Now I'd like to show you close-up of the autocomplete function. Here it's an example of a text being translated from English into Czech, and as soon as you press the first key with the first letter of the word you are going to write, you get a suggestion from the autocomplete feature. So it could be very helpful in audiovisual translation as well. Now, if we talked about machine translation as a source of inspiration, then these tools, concordancing and autocomplete, can really be much more beneficial than machine translation. But there are also other CAT features that would be very helpful, such as filtering. After all, when I mentioned concordancing, I'd like to say that it's a feature known from language corpora, which is also a tool which can be very helpful. And unfortunately, there are not too many corpora of subtitles, with the exception of fan subs, of course. There are large corpora with fan subs. Now, another tool I can think of is dictation software, which is often chosen by translators as an alternative to machine translation to improve their performance and also perhaps to prevent repetitive strain injury. But very often dictation applications don't support subtitling software or vice versa. So if you try to use dictation software in subtitling, what you often encounter is problems with misplaced spaces, hyphens, wrong capitalization, and dictation software also can have problems with colloquial vocabulary and morphology, because after all, dictation software is especially developed with professions like lawyers and doctors in mind. And that's why some dictation applications even change colloquial expressions to standard expressions, which is something you don't want. But again, all these tools should be optional. It should be like a buffet ready for the feast. After all, we as translators can use dictionaries, but it's also an optional tool. Nobody forces you to use your dictionary. But, you know, I often feel that quality and performance could be improved by good old human collaboration, with good cooperation between the subtitler and the QCer, with constructive feedback. Very often we see that there's very little feedback from the client to the subtitler. Another thing I can think of is good annotations on difficult expressions by script authors or by native speakers, because an annotation or an explanation of a very obscure slang term can save us translators and subtitlers much more time than machine translation. Also, since audiovisual content is often translated into multiple languages at the same time, I feel that we could, if we could collaborate, those of us who are translating the same thing into several languages at the same time, I think we could also help each other and improve the quality and the performance. And for all of this, of course, you also need some appropriate tools, appropriate technologies, and I feel that all of this can improve the sustainability in our profession. But back to machine translation. When machine translated suggestions are offered, I feel that it should be they should be easy to delete or hide, because it should be up to each and every subtitler whether or not he or she wants to use machine translation suggestions or not. And ideally, they should only be displayed on demand. In other words, machine translation suggestions should not come pre-filled in the boxes. Well, so that's the technical side.
Yes, thank you very much, Mirek. I'm going to dive into the professional aspects now for our vision for machine translation done right. The first point that I just want to touch upon again, that Mirek already explained in more detail, is that machine translation should be an optional tool, and the individual translator should be able to decide whether they want to use it or not. Then the next point is fair pay. We think that the use of machine translation should not affect the current rates of the market. Potential efficiency gain should go to the translators 100%. As a compensation for the missing inflation adjustment for the last 20 years. Then again, the sustainability that Mirek already briefly mentioned before. I want to cite Joss Morkins from Dublin City University here. And she suggests a so-called triple bottom line approach, where sustainability is key and the needs of all the parties involved are met. So this, of course, goes back to paying the translator adequately, but also creating an environment that is comfortable to work in for everybody involved. Now, what can we as translators do? We should try to get involved in the development process of the tools that we are going to use and give feedback regarding our needs. We should obviously get involved in the negotiation of payment models. So we need to say what we expect, what we need in terms of monetary value. We should make a case for the right to keep our own translations locally. Since we produce them and we are the authors, we should have the right to refer back to them for future projects. And we ourselves should think about what a sustainable rate would be. And we should also adhere to the rates that we establish together. If we try to undercut ourselves, we're just going to suffer in the long term and going to drop out of this industry. And in a similar vein, we definitely have to offer guidance to newcomers in the industry in order to avoid exploitation and guarantee a certain level of quality.
Yeah, those are some great ideas, and I completely agree. That's a good vision for MT done right in our profession. But yeah, I actually don't have any more questions. So I think this was a great interview. I learned a lot. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. And have a nice day. Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.